You've waited several long months since May for the Winnipeg Jets to finally return, and tonight, the start of the season is here. It's Winnipeg Jets hockey time on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
Your Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, it is finally time for the start of Winnipeg season. Preseason hockey, prospect showdowns, all that stuff, it's all over with. The season's here, right? We've already seen a few teams start their seasons off. The Jets are getting a little bit in later compared to some of the other teams, but hey, better late than never, right? And maybe a few extra days off isn't the worst. Every day that we get closer to having a healthier team again is probably a bit of a miracle for the Jets, right? So we want everyone healthy, we want them back, and maybe a few extra days off isn't the worst thing. But of course, I want to talk about tonight's game against the Stars, kind of revisit some thoughts about the season predictions and where Winnipeg will finish this year. Have I kind of revised any of those thoughts? Where do we go from here, right? And then finally also talk a little bit about the graphic the Jets put out about their top line and what, that sort of says about where the team's going and perhaps what Winnipeg really should be doing with this top line, especially if they don't replicate their success from last year. But before we dive into all the fun stuff tonight, wanted to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com, and you could win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, Jets, it's time for hockey. It is time to face the Dallas Stars. We have been looking forward to or dreading, depending on how you feel about this, the return of Dallas hockey. Obviously, we saw the Jets, unfortunately, fall a bit short against this team in the playoffs last year. And that one felt like more of a dagger than usual, right? Not just because we all sort of thought the Jets might be a team of destiny after 1.6, but like Scheifele losing his dad and the way that the team really rallied around him, how, both fan bases really embraced him. It just sort of felt like Winnipeg really should have been the one to go through. But unfortunately, the reality of hockey and the way the league works, it didn't go that way. And so now the Jets have a chance to kind of come back to start the season and show Dallas that Winnipeg is still serious and still ready to go far and win. So rolling into this game, we have a very different Jets lineup than we saw last year. If you haven't really been paying that much attention, well, congrats. You're about to look at a very different team than last season's. The one thing that you will remember, though, is we've got Connor Scheifele and Velarde as your first line. You know that I've got a talking point about this later, and specifically about the fact that there's even a graphic talking about the top line being locked up. But of course, CSV, barring any surprises, will be your opening night line one, and probably the line one for almost this entire season. Second line, though, this is where there's some potential for some change, right? Right now, it's expected that Nyquist, Toews, and Chibrikov will play together. Toews is technically still day-to-day, and he was on non-injury reserve or whatever, but or non-roster, like non-injury, something. I forget the exact designation. Basically, it's like a unique designation that's not quite IR, not quite the usual injury designation, but he's just day-to-day, right? So I would have to be, out of my mind to think he's not playing this game. This is the first game that he could possibly play at home in the regular season in a Jets jersey. I would think he would practically crawl across the ice if he had to in order to be in. So expect him to be in. I would think he takes even the first opening faceoff. I would not be shocked if that's the case. And you had better prepare yourself for the roar inside Canada Life Center, because it will be absolutely insane, especially if he scores the opening goal or even just a goal. Canada Life will explode. On the third line, you've got Niederreiter, Nemesnikov, and Iafallo, and then the fourth line, Koepka, Barron, and Pearson. On defense, probably no real shocks here. Morrissey and DeMello, Fleury, Pionk, and then Stanley and Shen. Now, I'll say off the bat, these D pairings are rough. We all knew that without Samberg, this unit would be a little shorthanded. I am a little concerned just looking at this group, and I still don't know why, Colin Miller doesn't really get a look. I think if you had Stanley and Miller as your third pairing, that'd be pretty okay. Like, it's not going to be perfect, but you've got two guys in Stanley and Shen who are not the most mobile in the defensive zone. Why not look for a guy who can maybe help out with that? Especially Miller, because Miller also helps out on the power play too. So it is what it is, right? It's probably a marginal difference at this point, but I just think already, this Jets defense really does need some support. And the rumor is the Jets are looking for potentially someone out there. So we'll have to see who it is that they pull out of whatever team is trying to dump somebody, because usually Winnipeg is more in on depth defenders. It'd be great if they maybe go a little bit higher, but I'm not really expecting anything too crazy. But for opening night, right, this is probably fine enough. Hellebuck will get the start. Comrie will back up. And, looking at this team, I would have to think the Jets have a decent shot of at least getting a point out of this game. The challenge is, the Dallas Stars are kind of deep. Up front, they've got Steele, Hintz, and Rantanen on your first line, Robertson, Johnston, and Bork on your second, Blackwell, Duchesne, and Sagan on your third, and then Ernie, Faxa and Bastion on your fourth. On the blue line, Lindell and Heiskanen, then Harley and Lundqvist, and then finally Bichel and Lyubushkin. In that, of course, it's going to be Ottinger, backed up by DeSmith. So, this team, probably the best team on paper in the Central. The thing that I do feel with them, and maybe people will disagree with me, but I'm not as high on them as I was last year. I think DeBoer to Gulutzan is a legitimate not improvement. I think, Gulutzan might prove me wrong, but I've never really been a fan of him as a tactician. So color me mildly skeptical that this whole team is going to play as well as it did last year. I could be completely barking up the wrong tree, but when I saw Glenn's work in Calgary and some other places, I just wasn't really that much of a fan. So, is it enough to torpedo the amazing talent that they have? I don't know. But I think Dallas is kind of the template of what I really think the Jets could do at some point with what they have. But it would also require Winnipeg changing some of the ways that they think about their line combos. And I suppose I'm a little less, I don't necessarily see that as being the way that this is going to pan out. So, it is what it is, right? But if I had to call a score for this game, I will go 4-3 Jets, and probably in overtime. I don't know. This feels like an overtimey kind of game. Give me your score predictions, though. Let me know what you think the Jets are going to do. But I think Winnipeg could come out with a win here. It's going to be tough, though. The way that this team does line up against the Jets, it's certainly favoring Dallas on paper. And, maybe even during the Central this year, we see Dallas rise to the top. But, it is a one-off game. The Jets do have some really good talent, and it's a home game for the Jets, right? There's going to be a lot of energy. I think the building's going to be rocking. So let's hope that Winnipeg comes out on the winning side. Now, speaking of talking about the Central and stuff, I thought I would talk a little bit about some of my early thoughts heading from even before preseason about what this year would look like and kind of where I see the Jets heading now, especially with all the injuries in tow and what Winnipeg might need to get to the next level, coming right up in just a brief moment. But before we dive into all that, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you do not want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Now, if you are somebody who likes to follow along with the games, why not add some extra fun to it, right? FanDuel is safe, secure, and you get payouts super quick. It makes watching every game even more exciting, more intensity, more action, and you have a stake in it, right? It's a great opportunity to potentially win big. And if you think you know those player stats better than anyone else, this is your chance to cash in big time, right? You've got the rating for maybe passer accuracy on a guy like Lamar or Mahomes. Maybe you think that gives you a competitive edge. This is your chance to find out. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started so you can win big. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about the start of the season. And specifically, of course, this is opening night for the Jets. Season's already been a couple of days in, but I think for Winnipeg, right, what do I see this team doing this year? A couple of weeks ago, I've been asked about it, multiple times. We had a preview episode with our Central Division podcast hosts. And I think for the most part, I would say a lot of what I thought about the team back then probably still holds right now. I have the Jets finishing somewhere between third and fourth in the Central. I think Dallas and Colorado will likely finish ahead of them in the regular season. And especially with this opening stretch, right? I mentioned on yesterday's episode that I thought the Jets don't have enough injuries to where their schedule is going to be awful, right? Like the opening few weeks of the season are actually kind of favorable. If you're going to have, Samberg out for an extended period, who you play really does matter. And it doesn't seem like the Jets are facing that many elite teams, right? You've got Dallas, you've got the Mammoth, maybe. You've got the Kraken, who could be annoying. But like a lot of these teams, the Islanders, the Flyers, the Flames, these are teams the Jets really should be able to beat, even banged up this badly. Now, obviously, reality can change and things happen in a game-by-game basis, and so I may look like an idiot here in a few weeks. But I think the Jets still do finish relatively high. The last few years, they've been over like 100 points or just around 100 points, so I think Winnipeg is likely to finish around 100 points again. I think they're not going to be 116 points good again. I think that would be a really high bar for any team. But, 105 points maybe for the season. On the low end, if we have to say like a bottom, I would think like 95 or 96 points if things really start to take some hits, right? But like the Jets would have to have some very rough circumstances, I would think, to start really slipping that far. And, obviously they're not going to start off 15-1 to begin the year again, but, they're already dealing with some major injuries. It's not a shock that maybe the start to the season could be a little on the rougher side. But, at this point, when it comes to Winnipeg's season, I just don't really worry about the regular season that much. Yeah, their journey to the playoffs may be a little more tumultuous in some seasons than others, and certainly when you have injuries, that tends to change the math a bit. But I just don't really feel that concerned about the Jets making it. I think where all of my concern tends to be is what happens once they do, right? You're in the playoffs. Where do you go from here? And that's the part of the season that I think the Jets still are trying to put together, still trying to master. And, how this year goes is really going to be very telling of what they do at the trade deadline. Winnipeg has invested a lot of money and resources into the core group of players that they have, but a lot of the stuff around them right now is still very much in the air. Yeah, you've got Toews, who might be a really solid middle six contributor. He just has to stay healthy, right? And I think that's really the bigger question is, what does he look like throughout the whole season? I really couldn't tell you. I don't think he could either until he gets out there and starts playing a few months in. So I'm giving him some extra time to sort of catch up. I'm looking at other guys like Nyquist and Pearson and of course Koepka. And of those guys, I think Nyquist is probably going to have the largest impact. Koepka and Pearson are, fourth liners. I like Koepka a lot. Pearson, I think the skating is really the only thing that's holding him back. But Koepka, I thought, has shown really well in preseason and camp. So, I think your bottom six will probably be pretty good. But again, is it going to be enough to go really deep in the postseason? The biggest issue for the Jets may be scoring goals. You have a lot of forechecking ability. You have a lot of wall battling ability. Do you have a lot of goal scoring ability? And that's where I think Winnipeg may see a bit of a step back. Also, probably a slightly underrated storyline, but, without Ehlers, right? Yes, he was underutilized, but on the power play, that was not the case. That first power play unit had a ton of Nick Ehlers time. What does that unit look like without him? We already are down Perfetti, too, to start the season, and Cole was supposed to be the one that took over his spot. But even Cole is just not the same as Ehlers was on the power play. So much of what made that unit even more dangerous was Ehlers was this fantastic rotating option that would sort of change positions. You could use him almost anywhere in the unit, and he'd probably do something really fun. the new unit doesn't quite have that same sort of dynamic roaming threat. So how do you compensate for that? Who takes over that role, and what are they going to do? We'll have to wait and see, right? This is going to be a different experience. Right now, with Perfetti out, Iafallo, I think, was practicing on the first unit. Chibrikov was practicing a little bit on the second unit. I think the second unit will have a lot of passing and shooting ability. You've got Toews and Nyquist there, but in terms of effectiveness and stuff, we'll have to see, right? I do think the unit's not going to be quite as good as it was last year. I think the personnel change will probably have something to do with that. That said, I do think the second unit might be improved over last year's unit. In fact, I feel pretty strongly that it will be a much better second unit. So maybe the hit that PP1 takes is balanced out by having a really strong secondary unit. So, yeah, I think the power play should be good. The PK, now the PK is where I maybe have some questions. The PK, especially to start this year, could be rough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We don't have a lot of blue liners who defend well on the PK, especially with Samberg out. And the Jets seem to be using guys like Pearson on the PK, which Pearson's not the route I would go. Tanner is obviously not in the best skating shape these days. You need somebody who can quickly move the puck up the ice, who can get it out quickly, who can even spring counters. And that's just not a role that I think would necessarily suit him. I think if you have him at 5v5, that's where he'll do a lot more for you, especially inside the offensive zone. So on the PK, you're going to have to really ask guys like Iafallo and Kepka and Barron to really step up. But, with the blue line being the way it is, I do think, especially early, that could take a bit of a hit. Is it enough to necessarily sink the Jets' start to the season? Probably not. And I think that's kind of the vibe I get with this team is, despite the injuries, the scheduling is thankfully okay enough to where I think the Jets can make it through. But it is going to be a bit of a challenge. I don't look at this as a particularly easy start to the season. So, we're just going to have to play it by ear and see how Winnipeg handles maybe some of the added pressure. I think, there's also internal expectations for this team to try and sort things out. And if things really don't go well for the first month and a half, Winnipeg will make changes. There will be no question about that. I think, there's pressure from ownership to try and win. They brought in some big free agents who are supposed to be championship winners. We know Pearson and Toews have multiple rings, but, in terms of the actual quality of the roster, you probably need some help. So all that to say, I still feel pretty good about the Jets making the playoffs. Even with everything that we're seeing, I really don't see a scenario where they miss. The only way it really does happen is if like something happens to Hellebuyck. If he does not have his usual standard of being excellent, I do start to have a couple of questions. Again, not big ones, but you start to wonder a little bit. Hellebuyck is kind of one of the pieces that is so critical to this team's success that if he shakes and wavers, you have a little bit more of a question mark. And traditionally, he does start out the season a little bit slower, which, with the Jets' defense being the way it is, might mean a lot of the forwards are going to have to really step up. So there are ways that I could see things poking holes in some of my theories here, but I'm going to try to be the optimist, right? I'll try and sit here and hope that Winnipeg is able to make it through. We know that the team always has like a next man up mentality, and if anything, right, like they always fight really hard regardless of the health of the team. So I'm hoping that it's enough to carry them through. The regular season is one where you can argue will over skill really does matter in some ways here. And will it be enough to carry the Jets through? I'm hoping so. I'm predicting that Winnipeg will have a fairly solid start to the season. But, the route could go through some tough moments. Murat Atesh from The Athletic even said the same thing. So nothing is guaranteed. Treat every game like it's going to be, a game 7. Make it through these first few weeks, and I think the rest of the start of the season will be fine, and we're going to be kind of on pace to have that 3rd or 4th place finish. If the Jets can find a way to rise above that, awesome. But I think at this point, the regular season expectations for me are modest, right? Good, but modest. The playoffs are where your objectives really lie. How do you get to that next level? One area, maybe it's about changing the first line, but if anything, I think the Jets have actually communicated that their first line is not going to change anytime soon. We'll chat about why coming right up in just a brief moment. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we're just sort of wrapping up real quick here. You've all probably seen the graphic from the Jets. So obviously the KFC video that they put out when his announcement went live was really funny. I thought it was very clever. And the Jets social media team does tend to really just hit it out of the park. I feel like their off-season and social media posting, content creation has just been exceptional. And it's why they actually won an award and recognition for it. The graphic, though, that they put out about the top line being signed for, 5-6+ years, I'm feeling not as good about that one. The Jets' top line of Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde improved a lot last season, right? Compared to previous years, it was like a world above the old version. The problem is like the Jets top line compared to other top lines out there tends to be more 50-50, which puts them, not necessarily in the back half of the league, but I would say closer to the middle of the pack than the top of the pack. And for the Jets, that's kind of hard, right? Winnipeg is a team that's built to win by committee. So if their top line isn't capable of winning as many of the matchups as it needs to, it does kind of have some real downstream impacts on the rest of the team. I've talked a lot about this, especially with the idea that the Jets kind of need to move more towards like a top 9 sort of approach. Right now, I still think Winnipeg is very much in the top 6, bottom 6, even if maybe the second and third lines sometimes share closer deployments. I think in terms of the matchup and role stuff, Winnipeg is still generally in the same mindset it's been for many years now. And this top line, I think, is a really good example of where if the Jets were willing to give it more of a change, even if it's just changing out Velarde for somebody else, I think that could improve the team, at least in some ways, right? You're not going to solve every problem by just switching around 1 or 2 players, but Connor and Scheifele are sort of attached at the hip, and that comes with a host of challenges. If you can find a way to maybe mitigate some of the defensive lapses and stuff and give them somebody who can do maybe more of the grindy work and allow them to sort of attack space more, I think you have a way to work around that. Again, like sometimes it's a little bit about mitigation, right? They're calling the shots for the first line, and I think the Jets kind of are sort of giving in there. It's understandable. They're 2 of your star players. They get precedence over a lot of other guys. But at some point, if this top line is not able to elevate the way it did last year and even go beyond that level of improvement, you have to really have that conversation about, should the tail wag the dog? And like, I always feel to some degree that if you're Scott, you have to be willing to kind of take them aside and make a tougher decision. I know Arneal has a really strong relationship with the team right now, and he doesn't want to compromise that. And I think in a lot of ways, the guys really do trust his judgment. I think that they feel very comfortable with him, and I think that's led him to do some things differently than other coaches. But this Jets top line, for whatever reason, seems to be one of the only areas that they don't feel they can make a change. This year will be very interesting to see if that holds. The fact that we're seeing a graphic from the team tells me they already know the top line is not going to change. But I wonder, right? Say an injury happens, you have to make some adjustments. Velarde gets pulled because he does tend to get hurt a lot. Who goes up there, right? How do you compensate? Who do you give opportunities to? And if that top line really starts to thrive, do you rethink having CSV as your number 1? I know from my perspective, I would have made that change a while back, but, I don't get to call the shots, right? A lot of us are just, we're all bystanders in a way. So how the team kind of approaches this will be very interesting this year, especially because, like I said, a lot's going to be on the shoulders of this top line, and I'm not quite sure that they're as equipped to handle it. They're all a year older, and while the top line had some really strong games last year, there were also a lot of games where they couldn't really have that much of an impact at 5v5. So how that all shakes out this year will be fascinating. I think going forward, what does this top line do? And as they get older and older, how much more can you ask of them? How long can they keep their performance up? And I think that's a bigger question that's going to certainly shape the next few years. I don't think it's going to be as much of an issue for the next few years, but as we maybe get into like year 3, 4, 5 of these contracts, maybe we have that conversation again. So Going to be a fascinating next couple of seasons. I keep saying that I really need the Jets to add around the edges here. They still need like a really solid middle six impact piece with some real upside, and I don't think that's easy to get. But if you can help sort of alleviate the burden and pressure from the first line um, and distribute the offense and goal scoring ability more, I think it just benefits everyone. Right now, Winnipeg doesn't have any interest in doing that just yet, or at least hasn't shown that they are. Maybe they're thinking about it, maybe they're not. But I think if you want to find a way to get this team to that next tier in the playoffs, find those ways to win those matchups elsewhere. It'll make everything kind of work a lot better than what we've seen. Again, where the Jets are is that they've got a strong foundation to build from. Now it's time to figure out how to take that foundation and expand upon it. There's a lot of stuff that's in place to do well. Can they take that next step? What is their next step? What is the next level? All questions that the Jets have to answer over the next few weeks and months. And really, for the course of the season, this is going to be one of those years where we don't necessarily have the clearest picture of where the team goes. So, big questions. Hopefully, Winnipeg can take them and answer them and silence any of the doubt. This team, if nothing else, they always fight hard. They'll always give you 110%. Hopefully, that 110% gets rewarded. I was really crushed for them last year when I thought that maybe they'd be able to work past some of their issues and just win, right? But, eventually time catches up, and some of the things that I was hoping for didn't quite pan out. So, now is a chance to flip the script again and go further. But curious to know how you feel about all this. Drop your thoughts and comments below in the top line, what you hope for them for this year, what you expect from them, all that fun stuff. We'll probably chat about that on a future episode. But for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. We'll have a recap of Dallas versus Winnipeg tomorrow. So see you then. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.